everybody. Welcome to Digital Hammurabi. I am Megan Lewis, for those who are new to the channel. Very nice to see you all. We've had a bit of a summer hiatus with vacations and children being off school, and generally speaking, during the summer, academia takes a bit of a break because everyone is abroad looking at archaeological sites and doing archival research. But we are back. And today we have Matt Szafran with us. He is going to be talking about Pre-Dynastic Pallets from Egypt, which I'm very excited about because I know a little bit about them. I know basically what they are and that they exist. So looking forward to finding out about what they may have been used for and how you make one, because who doesn't love knowing that? Okay, so Matt has a very handy PowerPoint here for us. So Matt, I'm going to turn over to you. Go for it.
Well, obviously the first title. There was a Twitter a while ago with people sneaking different film titles and things into presentations and into dissertations. I couldn't help myself, and I think the Harry Potter titles lend quite well to academia.
They do.
So if we flick to the first slide, I'll bore you ever so slightly with who I am and why I'm here. If anyone isn't following but would like to follow me, there's links to my Twitter and Instagram. I tend to be a bit more active on the Instagram more than the Twitter, mostly because the word limit annoys me. So I have been looking at pallets for about 3 years at this point. It started initially with just some research into Egyptian pigments and how they're created, how they might be used. And it somehow snowballed into creating my own pallets, realizing I don't agree with most of the standard statements about what actually pallets were used for. And most of what I'm going to talk about today ends up being in a paper that's going to be published very soon, hopefully, he says. I think I've got a last couple of pieces of research, and then a lot of this should be out there.
Fantastic.
So I guess for your viewers, you get a little sneak.
We get to preview. Where is it being published?
Hopefully, the Journal of Archaeological Sciences.
Oh, fantastic. Lovely.
Because there's quite a lot of experimental work.
Mm-hmm.
There's different imaging technologies, microscopy. It leans a lot more towards the sciences than necessarily all book research.
Mm-hmm.
I come from quite a scientific background, so looking at things analytically, I feel helps me bring something to this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So if we flick to the first page,
yes,
it's a little bit wordy, but essentially, pre-dynastic pallets are very simply flat pieces of stone. Some of them are carved, some of them are different shapes. They're all different sizes, different orientations. They're all made out of, well, in my opinion, they're all made out of one stone, but most books will tell you they're made out of either two different stones, either siltstone or greywacke, which are both very sedimentary stones related to things like a sandstone. They're only found in Egypt in one location, in the Wadi Hammamat, which we know was used in pre-dynastic times for their source, but also we have maps. I think it was a Ramesside map, which is in the Turin Museum, and it's an entire map of the quarries and all the different locations by colour. The standard answer of how pallets were used was for processing pigment, and it's usually linked with malachite, which is a green, very vibrant green copper colour. You'll sometimes see it today used for things like jewellery because it is very pretty. And for those who aren't familiar with Egyptian timelines, the dynastic is sort of from about 6000 BCE to around 3150. And that's when Egypt starts to move into the proto-dynastic and the dynastic times, when they have, the dynastic is really when they have a ruler. when there is a designated king or pharaoh who looks after all of Egypt. And the reason that probably people are quite familiar with pallets from museum contexts is they're the third most common grave commodity after pottery and beads. So they tend to show up quite a lot. Certain graves do have more than one, but generally speaking, there's usually only the one in there. So if we flick to the next slide,
yep.
They come in lots of different shapes. And the different shape is kind of indicative of the time period that it was created. So the earliest were the rhomboid shape, the kind of squashed diamond shape. For reasons that no one seems to know, and I don't have a good answer for you, things changed over time. Call it fashion, for want of a better term. And the rhomboid shapes gave way to different animal shapes. So you have birds, fish, hippos, turtles. And again, there was another stylistic change after a few more periods, and things moved into more of less decorated, less fancy, less complex, and became very square and in some cases just round. Mm-hmm. Sometimes with little details carved into the edge, like just a very simple pattern. And then towards the end of the pre-dynastic period, moving into the dynastic period, there became a kind of much more heavily decorated palette that was arguably used for ceremonial purposes.
Would the Nama palette fall into that category?
That would,
okay.
Yeah. That's probably the most common ceremonial palette as an example, which, if we flick to the next slide, yes. I won't go through all of the numbers. There is a reference on the bottom of the slide if you want to stick it in your comments for the video.
Yes, I will do.
That's the book that this data came from, which Excellent. Is arguably the Bible for this kind of research. I won't try and butcher the name. It's a Polish gentleman writing in French.
Excellent.
Yeah. But essentially what that chart tells you is that fish pallets were by and large the most common of all the different shapes. So when you go to a museum display and you see all the fancy gazelles and hippos and turtles, they're pretty much on display because they're much more rare. There are a lot more fish than there are anything else. So flipping to the next one.
Yes.
The background is the Nama pallets for this.
Hooray.
There were quite a few different decorated pallets, some much more elaborately carved than others. I'm not the best person to talk about those. I've not done very much research into the decorated pallets. I've steered more towards the animal shapes. There's a lot of scholarly debate, as always, about what decorated pallets were used for. Some people say they're a record of history, as in absolute facts. Mm-hmm. Some people say maybe it's more conceptual. Other people, maybe it's, dare I say, ritual. But from my perspective and my research, it's quite interesting to see that all of these ceremonial pallets still retain a location on their surface where you can still process pigment. So in the case of the Nama pallet, there's a sort of well that's created by the two beasts with their intertwined necks, which look quite Mesopotamian.
They do.
I don't know when cross-pollination happened.
Pretty early on, I think.
So this is probably around the 3000 BC sort of era. So moving on to the next slide. How did they make these things? This actually covers both the simple, just flat stone, the animal-shaped ones, and also the ceremonial pallets. They all pretty much follow the same process. So your very first choice is finding a suitable piece of stone. you would go to the quarry, and human nature being what it is, you'll find something that's about the right size, about the right shape for what you want. And I would assume take that home, take that to your workplace to work on that. Mm-hmm. The first step to do is something akin to flint knapping, where you take a hammerstone and you refine your piece of raw stone into something that's about the right sort of size. The siltstone itself actually breaks quite well. The phrase I like to use mostly for the pun is it has advantageous cleavage. And you can predict to a degree how it's going to break and where it's going to break. Mm-hmm. So if you hit it in the right place, you can turn it into roughly the right sort of shape. From that, you move into a more of a refinement process where you use flint saws and different grinding techniques, and pretty much give yourself a nice perimeter of your pallet, make it look like it is whatever you want it to look like, whether it's the sort of shield shape from the ceremonial pallets, whether it's a fish or a hippo or whatever else. Then you would take more grinding processes and essentially flatten it so that you have a suitable working surface, either for pigment processing or for whatever ceremonial use and for carving. Mm-hmm. If you do look at the Narmer pallet, the upper layer of the carving is very uniformly flat, and then the surface has been carved into. So after you've got a nice flat surface, you then add your details. If it's more decorative, then you'll do the carving phases. And if it's something like the fish, then you'll add in things like the fin details, give it a mouth. A lot of them tend to be smiley or frowny. My own ones tend to frown a little, but maybe that's just me. The more so the animal-shaped pallets tend to have a hole drilled in the upper surface of them, and it's often cited that that's some sort of suspension hole, so you could thread some cord through, so you can hang it on either your person or in your hut or somewhere. Interestingly, the rhomboid-shaped pallets don't have that. Neither do the later pallets when they move more to the square and circular style.
So the rhomboids were the earliest ones.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the middle set, the animals, they're all have suspension holes, but not the two styles bookending them.
Yeah, which is a little bit strange. So for whatever reason, and again, it's anyone's guess as to why. It's anyone's guess as to exactly what that hole was for, but suspension seems the most likely. Mm-hmm. I mean, I did personally make one, and I used it as a Christmas tree ornament, but I suspect that wasn't the original
may
use.
Not have been the first use.
Probably not. So if it is one of those animal shaped and it does have the suspension hole, then once you've added your details and you've polished your surface, you then use your flint drills and add in a suspension hole. And also, if there's any sort of inlays, a lot of the animals tend to have bone or shell as the inlays for their eyes, particularly with a small hole drilled in the center, so the adhesive kind of pours through and gives it almost like a pupil. So you'll drill or carve in the hole for the inlay, and then mix up some adhesive and shape and add in your inlay as the final step. Because essentially the inlay is quite fragile, and you don't want to be doing any grinding processes once you've already added your inlay. Otherwise, you're very likely to damage it. So your channel's question and strapline, how do we know this, is answered by the next slide.
Excellent. Yay, experimental archaeology.
That fish is one I created.
It's awesome.
Thank you. It's not siltstone because Egyptian siltstone is very hard to find in the southeast of England.
You surprise me.
Yeah. Well, you've not lived here for a while, so.
No, that's true.
Yeah. That's actually a piece of slate which originally was meant to be a trivet for the kitchen and came from Amazon. But they work very similarly. The slate is a little bit softer, but essentially they work the same, and they need the same sort of processes and the same sort of tools work. So flipping to the next slide, that's essentially the toolkit that you need. I'll go clockwise from the bottom near the word Pre-Dynastic. There's some very small pebbles, and those are your polishing pebbles. So once you've refined your surface, you can use those. They work best if you use them wet, so just a little amount of water, and essentially just polish your surface. I found different pebbles have different grades, so I have an ever-growing collection of small pebbles, and every time I go somewhere, I see a small river pebble and think, oh, I need to take that home. And then you take it home and then you test it and say, oh no, that one's more coarse than the last one. No, I wanted a finer one. Okay, I'll go and try and find another one. And I suspect that's a sort of process that would have been the same as the ancient peoples would have done, that they would go places, they would find a stone and think, okay, let's see how that works. I'll take that home. So going clockwise, the top couple of stones are just very simple grinding stones. The larger one is a piece of basalt, which is a very hard stone. It's harder than, it's a tiny bit harder than siltstone. And the other one is a piece of sandstone, which is softer and does break apart, but does actually still work as coarse grinding. So when you are working the perimeter, working more shapes, you'll use those stones as a hard grinding medium, a bit like maybe in the modern day we would use a file or something like that, or if we're being mechanized, maybe an angle grinder. And the piece of sandstone has an interesting break on it, which is how I use the details of the fins. It's got an almost 90-degree break at one point. So if you turn the stone, it's hard to explain. If you turn the stone, so the very tip of that break is kind of 45 degrees, then it carves a sort of V channel. And if you look at the museum examples, you'll see that things like the fins and the mouths, they're carved in a very similar way that give you that sort of a V shape. So I suspect that it was a very similar stone used with that kind of break on it. The other item at the top of the photo are drills. There's one specific drill which is quite thin and pointy for the suspension hole. But then the other one is much more flat, and to be pointlessly technical, it's a spatulate bit. So it's a very rounded shape, and that's needed for the eye holes. So it gives you a very wide but shallow hole, rather than the conventional flint drills, which are very pointy. Essentially, you would drill through the pallet before it's wide enough for the inlay. I made that one essentially by reverse engineering the shape and size of holes to work out exactly how you would cut one. I haven't seen one of those as a museum example. They tend to be more pointy, but I'm very confident they've just not been found. I can't think of another way that you could do that process, not in a time economical way. The two items under those are kind of related. There's a Flint Saw, which is very useful for doing straight cuts to refine the outer perimeter of something. And the thing above it is essentially the maintenance tool for your Flint Saw and your Flint Tools. It's a small piece of copper embedded in an antler. And you can then use that as a pressure flaker and break off little chips of flint as your tool starts to dull, starts to blunt. Or if, as I often found, it's not quite the right shape for what you want to do, you can refine your piece of flint and you can reshape it into exactly what you need. So then the last 4 items in the middle are different flint tools. There's a couple of what's technically called a burin, a very kind of pointy. You can use it for scribing, you can use it for slight drilling. There is also a micro drill, which has a little point on the very bottommost piece.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very fine, almost like a needle. And I needed that for drilling the inlays for the eyes. So as I mentioned, the eyes are typically round. The inlay has a very small hole in the center, and it's very difficult to get that small hole without an extremely small bit.
Mm-hmm.
So flipping to the next slide. I've said I've made my fish using those. How do I know that those are the sort of tools that we used? Some of them are found in museums. Some of them I've not seen in museums.
Mm-hmm.
However, stone tools leave traces on the surface of things. So I've got a couple of examples. The first one on the next slide is if you look at the outer perimeter of most of the animals, especially fish, because they're quite a simple shape, you can see that they're described by lots of straight lines that intersect each other. And that's very indicative of lots of straight saw cuts. So much like people I'm sure are familiar with sawing wood, your saw cuts in a straight line. You could cut out a fish shape in wood very quickly by doing lots of straight cuts and slightly rounding edges with another straight cut, and then blending that together a little bit with some simple grinding.
Mm-hmm.
So the first example is an object in the Petrie Museum here in London, and the three pictures below are part of the process of creating my replica from the earlier slide.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, you can see it's got a basic scribed outline. I found it's best to slightly saw on one side, slightly saw on the other, put it on a hard edge, and then hit it. It saves a lot of time sawing through,
mm-hmm.
and the two saws kind of help focus the force to where you need them. Much like how when you cut a tree down, you cut a notch in one side, you cut a notch in the other side, and it falls what you expect it to.
Mm-hmm.
It's very similar, strangely, with creating a fish out of stone. And then once you've got those cuts, obviously they're quite angular, you take your grinding tool.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, it's a piece of sandstone, and you just sort of round the points left by the two intersecting saw cuts. And then that gives you the shape of the fish that's in the first example, that it is lots of straight lines, but they are slightly blurred together at the end. So I'm very confident that that sort of a process would have been done, because basically my experimentation seems to meet what is in museums. And the next slide has some fancy imaging, partly because I like the colours. The top piece is another Petrie Museum example, and the bottom piece is my fish again.
Mm-hmm.
And these have been imaged with a process called RTI, reflectance transmission imaging, where you shine a light source multiple times over the surface, and with a lot of computation and maths, the programs work out how light bounces around, and it helps you kind of accentuate the features. So whilst you can see the grinding lines in person with your eye, this process makes it a lot clearer. So hopefully you can see the turtle has a lot of scratches, a lot of grinding marks on its
mm-hmm.
surface. And so does my fish. Now, a lot of papers, almost exclusively, a lot of books, almost exclusively, will tell you those grinding marks come from the actual processing of pigment. My fish has never been used to process pigment, and it has all those same marks. So I actually think that's not quite correct, and all of the marks on the surface are actually caused basically by the process of making the thing itself. So the polishing phases still leave they still leave marks. There's nothing that's quite perfect, because at the end of the day, it's a pebble that you're rubbing around on the surface. You don't have different grades of very fine sandpaper and polishing wheels to get something super shiny and super polished. So I think just about every pallet that you'll see will have those marks on it. And again, from my experimentation, my fish has all those same marks in all the same orientation. I think it's much more likely that the grinding lines are purely from manufacture and not from use.
Interesting.
And the next slide is very wordy. I don't normally like wordy slides, but in this case, I needed to have this quote in there because it's always stated that pallets are used for grinding malachite, which I've highlighted in green because malachite's green. Everything up to and including today, if you look at museum labels, just about everything always says it's used for grinding malachite. Almost all books say that it's used for grinding malachite. I'm being very pedantic, but that's not the right term. As far as I can tell, this is the very earliest of reference. It's from Flinders Petrie in 1895. And it seems that because Petrie said it, everyone has repeated it. And everyone who references another paper repeats that one.
I see.
And that term has just propagated. If we flip to the next slide, this is how you really process malachite. And it's not by grinding. When I started this project, I wanted to do some work with ancient pigments. I got some malachite, I got some rocks that were quite hard, and I tried grinding the malachite on a rock. And pretty much nothing happened. My malachite was slightly scratched and there was a tiny amount of green on the rock. It's, technically speaking, you could do that and eventually you would grind away your malachite. However, what I found is it's much faster to take a malachite, put it on something hard and hit it with a stone. It causes the malachite to shatter. You'll get a mix of powder and small crystals. If you keep hitting it, the small crystals get smaller and smaller, and you're left with quite a coarse powder. What I did find the hard way is that when you first smash it, the malachite is quite flyable and tends to go everywhere. And then you spend the next hour trying to find all the pieces of malachite that have just exploded.
Excellent.
Yeah. So instead, what you need to do is you need to capture the malachite in something. I think linen is probably quite likely. We know the pre-dynastic people had linen and plenty of access to it. You can also use leather, but this process does destroy whatever you wrap the material, whatever material you use to wrap it in. So I think it's probably quite likely whatever you have on hand, whether it's a piece of scrap leather that you don't need anymore that's worn out, whether it's a piece of old linen that's all worn out, whatever you have, you would use that. And you basically wrap your linen in that and then hit it with your big rock against another big rock. For the modern analogy, I would say it's very much like if you want to make a cheesecake, you put your biscuits, wrap them in cling film or something, and hit them with a rolling pin. It's that same process. It keeps everything together. So then if we flip to the next slide, once you have your quite coarse powder, from my work, I had crystals that were under a centimetre in diameter. So from there, you can then take a small stone and something flat, much like a pallet, and you can essentially just crush those small crystals into a very fine powder.
I see.
The smoother the stone and the smoother the surface that you're crushing against means you'll get a much finer powder. So in the previous slide where it's a very big piece of sandstone, it's quite coarse on the surface. That stone is not suited to creating a fine powder. And essentially you need a fine powder for pigments. You need a fine powder if you're going to mix that with something to form like a makeup or to form a paint.
Mm-hmm.
So I think here this is much more likely where the palette would come in as a useful surface, that you would take your pre-smashed malachite and basically just crush it when you need it into probably small amounts, mix that with something and then use it. As you can probably see from the scale in this one, that's a very small piece of actual siltstone. Mm-hmm. It's pretty much the only siltstone I could get our hands on. And it worked perfectly. So you will see in museums very small pallets that are often described as amulets. They usually all have a suspension hole, and in literature, they're not cited as being a practical, usable object. Mm-hmm. They're just cited as being an amulet. I think I've proven with that picture, no, that could definitely be used. Mm-hmm. You can obviously only process small amounts at a time, but it can absolutely be used.
Yeah.
From the next slides, the process of linen wrapping and smashing and crushing damages the linen. Interestingly, linen being made of very small fibers, those fibers end up as part of the malachite. So if you take your crushed and smashed and ground malachite and you look at it through a microscope, you will see lots of very small fibers. From my research, I have found that the fibers in my experimental sample were between 8 micrometers and 23 micrometers. And apparently the average human hair is 14.7. So there are fibers, and quite a lot of them, that are much smaller than human hair. Mm-hmm. And this is a little bit of speculation, but I do think that the presence of these fibers would form a reinforcement. So similar to how modern concretes have either rebar in them or have actual microfibers added to them to form a much stronger compound. Mm-hmm. The presence of these microfibers, I'm sure it was accidental, but would cause a more stronger product than if the fibers weren't there.
Interesting.
And I do wonder if that's why you still see a lot of malachite staining on the pallets, because it's much more robust than maybe some other colours that could possibly have been used. I've done a little bit of research on a museum example that actually still contains malachite shards. It's not in here because I've not finished that research, but it does look very promising that there are actual fibres in an ancient sample. Yeah.
I was going to ask, would there be surviving linen fragments?
There should be.
That's fantastic.
And from what I've seen on that example, there are certainly fibres. Wow. Yeah, and they are smaller than average hair size. Mm-hmm.
That's exciting.
That is very exciting. Being in a quiet room doing research, you can't really scream and shout. But,
but that's what you would like to do very much.
Yeah. Internally, you have to scream and go, "Oh, I found it!"
That's a thing.
I'm very excited, but I can't really shout about this. Yeah. So that is something that's going to be in the final paper. I'm still doing a bit of research just to check the provenance on things like that. Mm-hmm. But I'm quite excited that certainly in this case there are malachite shards, and they do contain some sort of fibre. Mm-hmm. And they look very much like linen fibres. They don't look like hairs. Yeah. They're very twisty. They're very woven. So I think it's quite likely.
Excellent.
But to be decided and to be followed up in a paper. So kind of to start to conclude, in the next slide, how are pallets used? We know a few things. We know that malachite wasn't ground, it was crushed. We know that once you've crushed it and you've got those coarse shards, you need a flat surface to produce a nice fine powder. We know pallets have been found with green on them. We've also found very scant remains, but there are human remains that contain green pigmentation around the eyes, which does support Petrie's claim that the malachite was a pigment and it was used for eye makeup. I don't tend to like the word makeup because it has too many connotations about beautification, but I don't have a better word to use. Yeah. So use with caution. And there are also objects such as clay heads that are found in burials which have the green staining of malachite on their eyes. So we know that it was used in relation to the eyes, and certainly with the burials. So if we switch to the next slide, what can we conclude from this? It's very safe to assume that malachite was mixed on the surface of pallets. We have pallets that have malachite on them, both grains of malachite, as you can hopefully see in the background, and also just the staining of malachite on some other pallets. It's very common, along with occasional staining from red ochre. So I think it's quite likely that the malachite was refined on the surface of the pallets. It was mixed with some kind of base, probably a lipid from other people's research. And then, much like a modern makeup palette, it then serves a very useful surface for applying it to yourself, applying it to someone else, applying it to a body before it goes into the grave. We do also know that they were part of the funerary ritual. We've seen remains that have them. What we don't know is if they were or if they weren't part of daily life. There is speculation that the malachite was kind of an early sun defense, that you put it around your eyes and it would help to deflect the sun a little bit, not blind you quite so much. It's an interesting theory. There's absolutely no way to prove it. All we can really say is there are definitely remains that have been found. There are definitely things like the clay heads. So was it used in day-to-day life? Possibly. Was it used in burials? Certainly. Yeah. Which I think brings us to any questions and comments.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was very interesting. And I said off air, but your slides are absolutely beautiful. So thank you for being so well prepared. We do have some questions. If anyone else has questions, please put them in the chat and tag me at Digital Hammurabi. I probably won't see them otherwise. So we have a few questions already. Raphael Block says, do we know anything about the significance of cosmetics versus, for example, tattooing in Egypt and other ancient African cultures?
Oh, there's a lot in that question.
Yes. Our audience has the best questions, and half the time I have no idea.
I should have probably said this at the outset, but in the pre-dynastic times, there's no writing. So we don't categorically know anything, and that's why there's so much of this is guesswork. So, as I was kind of saying, do we know whether they were used in day-to-day life? No. Do we know the significance of why this was done? No. And one thing I find quite problematic, and something that people should be very careful when they read, is applying dynastic logic to pre-dynastic. They're separated by thousands of years. It's like me saying, well, I do this because in the Middle Ages, somebody also did this.
And you're definitely doing it for exactly the same reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the same way.
So people will tell you that the green is a symbol of new life, and that's why it was applied to the eyes, because we know that's a fact in dynastic times when they wrote down that green is the symbol of new life, and that's why we're doing it to burials. It's certainly possible, that it had the same meaning in pre-dynastic times, but it's speculation.
Yeah, we should be careful about that.
And we should be very careful to base something on an idea from thousands of years later. As for the significance of tattooing, I know very little about that. I know tattooing was done. I couldn't tell you why. So there's half an answer to the question.
That is more than I would have been able to give. Thank you. LT Galloway says, how were the pallets stored in the home or for travel? And did they have protective casing?
Oh, that's a very interesting question.
That is an interesting question.
Yeah, I like it. From the zoomorphic, the animal-shaped pallets, they have their suspension hole. It seems logical that that hole was done for a reason. It takes a long time to drill a hole through a piece of stone without a mechanical drill. You wouldn't do it if you didn't need it.
Yeah.
So I think it's very likely that would have probably just a very simple fiber loop, which is what I used for my Christmas tree ornament. In the home, you could hang that on the hook. So the idea of the suspension loop works quite well for hanging it in your home. Equally, on your person, you could attach that to your belt very easily. Siltstone isn't especially fragile, so you could have it on you all day, and so long as you're moderately careful, it's not going to break.
I see.
Yeah, so the other shapes are a little bit more difficult. I'm sure you could put them in a bag. Do we have protective cases? Not that I've seen. So I suspect not. In burials, they're just found next. That's a bit problematic as well. Often near the head, not exclusive. Unfortunately, it's not one of those pieces of statement of fact that they're always found near the head, therefore they were used for something in relation to the head. Technically speaking, and according to the maths from a different book, I can send you the source if you want to quote that.
That would be great.
It's actually more likely that it would be found by the arms or the feet than by the head.
Interesting. So
often by the head, certainly not exclusively, and certainly not in any sort of margin that means, yes, that's absolutely why it was there, and it was always there because it was used for that. So in the grave, they're just buried in the sand with everything else. There's no sort of protective case to it, and I would assume if you had one for your daily life, if protective cases were a thing, then one would assume you would bury it with one as well.
Interesting, thank you. Tim Smith has asked if you can tell whether there's a difference between pallets used, for cosmetics and for paint.
Oh, in theory, kind of, but it would take a mass spectrometer. From what I've read from people who study different bases, so the material that you mix your pigment with to basically make it sticky. If you're going to apply it to your body, then it's something like a lipid, a fat of some kind. Whereas for paints, you typically want something that's a lot longer lasting. So possibly something like a drying oil, maybe a poppy oil or something like that, or gum arabic, which comes from acacia trees. That's something we use in modern artistry today, and something that was certainly used back then. So can you tell just by looking at it? No. Can you tell if you did a mass spec? Possibly, assuming that you only use one base for one thing and one base for the other. But we don't tend to see anything painted green from pre-dynastic times. They tend to paint all their pottery with ochres, so very reds. Look at most painted pre-dynastic material. It's pretty much all in the ochres.
Okay.
So I'd love someone to prove me wrong on this, but I can't think of a case of anything painted green.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Vibrantly Brantley says, have you studied Egyptian blue pigments that include glass? Obviously, he says that's going to be a different time period to the palettes, but you mentioned you were looking at pigments in general.
Not very much, only as a cursory glance of what went into Egyptian blue, and ones that contain glass, I'm sure someone will call me out on this one, but I don't think there were any. Egyptian blue is typically quartz in there as well, which doesn't quite turn into glass in Egyptian times. Glass didn't really arrive until the Romans.
Excellent, thank you. Steve Bowden is asking how many samples of pallets are available for scholars to examine. He says he did a quick look through Wikipedia and it seemed to be that there were only 24 available.
Wikipedia needs to recount.
Okay, good.
I would say hundreds.
Okay, wow.
If you go to the British Museum, then there's a good 10 that's on display.
Right.
The Petrie's got quite a lot, and that's just 2 museums.
Excellent, and that's all they have on display. I know that oh, hello. Oliver's coming to join us. I know that the storage of the British Museum is full of stuff that is just never really seen the light of day.
Yeah.
We
things that aren't quite as pretty for display.
Yes, exactly.
And as I mentioned earlier, the display tends to be the more esoteric examples.
The unusual things.
The gazelle more than another fish. Another fish. A 200th fish. I could give you the numbers, but I don't have them to hand. But there are almost, I think, 100 fish, something like that. So I'll give you some references.
That would be lovely. Thank you. I'll put those in the description. Sorry. Somebody
doesn't like pallets.
No. Well, he likes them. He likes them so much he wants to just stay and grab everything in the room while we're talking, which is actually quite distracting. Yes, references would be lovely. Thank you. I can put them in the description. And if anyone is interested in just going to the British Museum, I don't know about the Petrie. I've not looked at their online collections, but if you go to the British Museum website, there's a link you can click that's like search our collection, and if you type in the keyword of whatever you're looking for, they'll give you a whole heap of examples. So I'm assuming if you type in pallets, they'll probably come up with a large variety.
Although from different cultures and periods.
That's true.
As a point of representation, the Petrie does have an exquisite collection, and everything is searchable online. Oh,
in that case, go to the Petrie, everybody.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And that's exclusively Egyptian, so it's obviously much better.
Easier to search. Raphael Block says that, well, as you've said, suspension holes imply portability. Is there any evidence of day-to-day use and easier pigments for like a quick touch-up of one's makeup?
To be fair, malachite pigmentation doesn't actually take a great amount or time of work to do. So this is more speculation, and take it for what it's worth. But my suspicion is that you would take a big piece of malachite. The piece I smashed was roughly fist-sized. Roughly crush that, put it in a bag.
Take it
when
with you.
You need something, take a little pinch out, take your palette out, crush it to a fine powder, and then use that for your touch-up.
Excellent. Thank you. And Raphael Block again, asking if the palettes were exclusively for malachite, or were they used?
No,
for
not exclusively. There are some. It seems most of the staining that you'll find on museum examples is green, but there are some that do still have ochre stains on them. So the reddy orange pigmentation. So we can say that most of them, if they have staining, it's malachite, but not exclusively. No, okay. I've certainly seen both. They're sometimes cited as being used for galena, a lead ore, although I can't really think of many examples that have any kind of leady black staining on them.
Mm-hmm.
So I fear that maybe another Petrie said this, so we just say it.
So we just keep going with it.
Yeah, he was right about everything, so yeah.
Well, that is actually all we have from the audience. Those were some great questions, everybody. Well done. Thank you. And yeah, I don't have any more questions for you, Matt. Is there anything that you want to emphasize or close with?
I'd like to say yes, but no. I'd like to have something dynamic to close on. No.
No, not a problem.
But obviously, if anyone does have any questions, then please hit me up on any of my social links.
I'll put, so the links, in case you missed it, are at the beginning of the stream in one of the slides. I will also put them in the description box. So if you want to get in touch with Matt, just check there, and there will be various means to contact him. If you are around tomorrow at about 2 p.m. EST, we are going to have one of our HAP scholars back on. Sarah Moore is going to come and tell us how she did with her summer research project that was funded by you guys. So that will be exciting. Please join us for that. And we have several other interviews coming up in the next few months. Please check the calendar. That's digitalhammurabi.com/calendar. If it's been organized, it's on the calendar, so you can check that out and join us. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Matt. That was absolutely fascinating. And if you let me know when your paper is published, I'll put a link to that in the description as well for those who want to take a look.
Fantastic. Thank you for letting me waffle about pallets for an hour.
It was absolutely fascinating. Okay, everybody. Thank you again. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?